Welcome everyone to our Evaluate webinar on Orphan Drugs, a Flattening Curve. My name is Rebecca Brooks and I'm the Events Manager at Evaluate. We're delighted to have so many of you joining us today. I'll shortly be handing over to Melanie Senior, who is the author of our recently published report on orphan drugs. Melanie will be introducing our speaker panel for today and will be setting out some of the context for the report. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping points. We do encourage you to engage with us throughout the webinar. If you have a question you'd like us to answer, please use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We will try and get through as many as we can. Any we don't answer, we will follow up with after the webinar. Our team is also on hand for any technical questions you may have. The webinar is being recorded and we will send you the link to access the on-demand version and a copy of the slides after the event. So without further ado, over to you, Melanie.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So many of you, I hope, will have seen last year's report. We set out how orphan drugs as a category have gone really from niche to the mainstream. In 4 of the last 5 years, orphan drugs have actually made up more than half of all of FDA's new innovative drug approvals. And in fact, in 2022, orphans' share was 54%, which is the highest yet. And this is also a category that continues to grow faster, significantly faster than non-orphan innovative drugs. Sales between 2023 and 2028 are expected to reach almost 12% for orphans compared to just 7% for non-orphans. So far, so similar to last year. What is new? Well, we're going to be discussing whether the orphan drug growth curve, as we look out to the end of the decade, may be starting to flatten. And we'll look at several potential reasons for that. One headwind is, of course, the US Inflation Reduction Act arrived last year, and it's going to impact the price of some of the biggest orphan drugs, those with multiple designations, as well as several non-orphans, of course. But aside from that, elsewhere in the industry, there are also signs of a broader shift towards drug R&D in more widespread conditions. So obesity, other cardiometabolic diseases, liver and kidney disease, and of course, Alzheimer's as well. And this is just partly about scientific progress. Many newer technologies, new drug modalities are tested initially in a niche or orphan setting very often. And now these are maturing and expanding beyond those initial areas. And that's an important transformation for the industry, although not one that we're going to have time to cover today. And another backdrop here, of course, is the patent expiries facing several drug companies towards the end of, or over the course of this decade and early next. From anything between 200 and 500 billion dollars worth of pharma sales potentially at loss from expiries. Evaluate has looked at this in more detail last year, both at the Vantage team and also in the World Preview report. And filling those sorts of huge gaps, sort of Humira and Keytruda-sized multi-billion-dollar drug gaps, is very difficult unless you have either the very biggest orphan drugs or some treatments for much more widespread conditions. So we're going to be joined today by Evaluate Managing Analyst Andreas Hadjivasiliou. He's going to talk us through some of the numbers behind the orphan segment. And we're also delighted to have with us Jeremy Levin, who is the CEO and chairman of Ovid Pharmaceuticals. Ovid is a developer of drugs for rare diseases, but Jeremy also brings much more experience to the field. He's board member and chairman emeritus at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization in the US, and he also has experience he ran Teva as CEO, and he also was head of business development at Bristol and at Novartis. So we're really pleased to have him with us, and I'm going to be asking Jeremy for his views on the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act on orphan drug R&D, And I'm going to be asking him whether the US Orphan Drug Act, the regulations underlying and the foundation of this tremendous growth we've seen in the category over the last 40 years, whether that is still fit for purpose. So, Andreas, I'll hand over to you to have a look at some of the data.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. So we've been looking at the orphan drug market for a number of years. We've done a number of reports in that time, and it's really been a story of continuous growth. And what I thought would be good to do is start by orientating everyone around the market size and where we see that going over the next few years through to 2028. So the first thing we looked at in the report was the worldwide orphan drug sales and their share of the prescription drug market as a whole through to our forecast horizon of 2028. And we can see that the market or the orphan drug space is going to continue to grow very healthily, I would say, over that period of time. It's going to reach or peak around 300 billion worth of sales in 2028. That's actually a compound annual growth rate of 12% a year, which is, I guess, a very enviable number. There's a clear development going on there. And that compares to somewhere around 7% compared to the non-orphan segment. So clearly, orphan drugs are growing. They're continuing to form a really significant part of the overall drug market, and that's going to, at the moment, as we forecast, continue all the way through to 2028. One of the things be quite nice to look at, though, and we did this in the report, is to pick out the key drugs in this space, because it starts to put a little bit of color around where those numbers come from and what's making them up. And that's one of the, on the next slide that we've got, we have the top 10 selling drugs as forecasted in 2028. So we're looking here at worldwide sales as forecasted by our consensus forecast. We've broken that out into the portion that we expect to be in the US versus rest of world. So I'm sure many of our viewers today will not be surprised to see that the US is typically dominating in terms of the overall proportion of sales that are going to be booked by these products over the time period. The other sort of thing that immediately jumped out when we were running through the report was just how many household names, well-known drugs are in this top 10 list. We're not looking at perhaps drugs that you might regard as obscure or not well-known. There's a number of them in there, starting with our number one in 2028, just north of 14 billion of expected forecasted sales, Darzalex. We have a number of other drugs in there that our listeners might be familiar with, like Lynparza, Imbruvica. These are drugs which cover a range of indications, and many of those are in a number of different spaces that you would perhaps consider more mass market rather than your classic orphan niche rare disease space. And that really reflects how the industry's been evolving over this time period, with companies being driven really by the science and being able to understand and segment ever more defined population subgroups and expanding their drugs into those areas. There are, of course, in that list drugs like Trikafta and Ultomiris, which are very much in that niche orphan space. They are typically targeted around one well-defined, perhaps genetic element of an indication. But by and large, we're looking at drugs as pipelines of their own with ever increasing numbers of indications. So one of the challenges, I guess, that we look at evaluate when we look at the orphan drug market is how to remove from our analysis drugs that are predominantly sold for non-orphan indications, but may happen to have a number of designations in very small indications which allow them to be classified as an orphan drug. Drugs like, for example, Opdivo or Humira, predominantly their sales come from non-orphan spaces, but they do have orphan designations. So one thing to call out and to be aware of is we've applied some rules around excluding certain drugs that may have a designation to ensure that we're getting as close to as possible a clearer view of the market. And as part of that, we look at lifetime or expected lifetime sales for these drugs. We aim to, or rather, we aim to exclude non-orphan drugs which have less than 50% of their sales coming from non-orphan indications. So that's why you'll see some of the drugs that you might expect to see in here, which might have designations. They're not in here because they don't quite meet that threshold, and that is changing all the time as companies file for new designations, as new designations or new indications are added to clinical trials and investigated. That can change. But we've also looked at the different companies that are active in this space, and that's really where our next slide brings that to light. We've explored the top 10 selling companies over the period, and again here what really stands out is the almost complete absence, or rather complete dominance, if you like, of big pharma. There's, I think, what I would describe as one pure play biotech in this list, Vertex Pharmaceuticals. The other companies here are very much your large pharma who are very, very active in this space. And that has changed a little bit over the years. We've been looking at the orphan drug market, and we have seen a number of companies that were active in this space either acquired or merged into other companies. A good example from the not too distant past is Alexion Pharmaceuticals. AstraZeneca acquired Alexion in 2021, and that's really pushed AstraZeneca up the list of companies with the most sales expected to come from orphan drugs. One of the other bits of this analysis here that is quite intriguing, I would say, is just the increasing proportion that orphan drugs make up of these companies' forecasted sales in 2028. For example, for Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca and Roche, we're looking at percentages upwards of 35%. Johnson & Johnson, I think it's approaching just over 40%. And that really demonstrates Big Pharma has completely bought into this space. They are active, they are acquiring, they are developing in this area. And it is very much mainstream now. There is very little left in terms of biotech, at least in the top 10. There's a number of developers further down who are active, and they might be the potential acquisition targets as companies look to fill and restock their pipelines over the next few years. And that's really where the pipeline of drugs is so important. And the pipeline of drugs is the lifeblood of the industry. That is the drugs of tomorrow, the revenues of tomorrow, and that's really key for all of these companies. And that was the next bit we looked at in the report, and is summarized on the following slide, where we investigated what does the pipeline look like through to 2028. We compared the orphan drug pipeline to the non-orphan pipeline each year over the horizon. And unsurprisingly, non-orphan drugs do form the majority of expected product sales in 2028. But orphan sales do still make up around 30% or thereabouts each year. What's different, I guess, compared to previous years when we've conducted this analysis is that the percentage is starting to flatten out. And that's the first time we've really seen that. in when we've been looking at the data in this. So whereas before you would have expected the proportion of orphan drug sales to continue to increase through the forecast horizon compared as a percentage of the total drugs, that's now flattening out. And it's really interesting if this is the beginning of a trend, or if it's a response to perhaps some of the new regulations that are being put in place. It's probably a little bit too early to definitively say what's driving this precisely, but I certainly think it's worth discussing what might be causing some of these changes in the industry. Again, one of the things we've speculated about in the report is potentially this is new modalities or technologies or approaches that are being used in orphan spaces that are now starting to move out into the non-orphan space, and that's where you're seeing the ability to drive significant revenue from larger indications, but definitely a space to watch.
Yeah, if I jump in, Andreas, sorry to interrupt. Thank you very much for setting that all out. And I think, it is remarkable. I think all of the evidence data you've shown just shows that these are mainstream products. And I mean, the top 10 drugs you showed, the point you made about household name, I mean, two of those top 10 orphan drugs are slated to be among the early set of most costly Medicare drugs that are subjected to price negotiations by virtue of being the highest cost to the US government health system. So, as you've said, these are not niche anymore, or at least the biggest ones are. I think what we all need to bear in mind as well, though, is that, as usual, the big ones hog the limelight. There are many much smaller orphan drugs that are out there that don't get the prominence in these kinds of data charts, and that are incredibly important. But I think we're highlighting and we're seeing the size of these, and therefore understanding, I think, why some of the legislative and regulatory winds are blowing the way that they are. And that's why, we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. But I think it is remarkable to see that. And even if that drop off is sort of a flattening or a temporary thing, I think it's definitely a valid question to ask as to, what we might be seeing going into the next decade, for sure.
Absolutely. And I think that's where we really mustn't lose sight of that initial 300 billion figure. I think our number one drug, Darzalex, is 14 billion of that. There's much more beyond that initial list. And again, within that 12% CAGR over the period, I mean, that's a fantastic, number to be able to hit. Will that happen, or will, like you said, events intervene, if you like? I think that's a really interesting question. But yeah, what I think is slightly different to before, and again, it's the hint at maybe the pipeline isn't quite where it was in terms of gaining market share of the total. And again, these numbers are subject to change as drugs inevitably succeed or fail to make it to market. These numbers will move around. I think thinking back even a few years ago with COVID, that wasn't in anyone's models or anyone's predictions. So you never know what might be happening over the next 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly picking up. I mean, a lot of people, I speak to quite a few investors and biotechs, and there definitely is a sense that what some called forgotten widespread conditions, respiratory, obesity, cardiometabolic, there definitely is a sense that interest is returning to those areas. Not at the expense, one hopes, of new treatments for rare conditions, but I think perhaps reflecting what what industry needs to do as a whole as far as population health is concerned. So I think that's all good, and it needn't draw away necessary dollars from orphan and very niche conditions. But we'll bring Jeremy in a few minutes to talk about how to get that balance right, if you like, between incentivizing R&D for very small conditions versus encouraging the widespread diseases to be tackled as well.
Absolutely. And I think, again, it goes back to the original act, and it's, I guess, the spirit of it, which was to provide incentives for rare or disease areas which were neglected, if you like, and we can use that term. And in that sense, it's been a success. The big pharma is now very much in this space. They're aware of how to launch. There's interest in acquiring these assets. There's a significant amount of pipelines that are going to need to be restocked over the next few years. I would not be surprised if some of these orphan assets are part of people's planning and considerations over that time period. But also, the opportunity is far beyond those immediate rare disease spaces. There are bigger indications where, if you can shift the treatment paradigm, you really do have a significant opportunity to bring in some significant revenue over the period. I think it might just be worth calling out our last slide with we looked at the top 5 drugs that we expect to be launched over the period. So these are either in phase 3 or filed. We examined their NPV, the net present value. And again, these are, if you like, the hopes of the various companies' pipelines. SRP 9001, that's a drug for Duchenne muscular dystrophy from Sarepta. There's been a number of drugs that have launched over the last few years in that space. Again, looking at the different profiles within that indication and targeting particular genetic aspects of that. So again, there's some real opportunity here to kind of move things forward in terms of treatments and improving patient outcomes. The J-PERCA, which actually was approved between us pulling the content for the report at the end of January. So that's for mantle cell lymphoma. So expect to see that on the market, I would assume, later this year. So there's, again, thinking about that pipeline of drugs, we've highlighted a few here, which are the current largest by NPV, using Evaluate's NPV, proprietary NPV methodology. There's many more that potentially will be in patients' hands over the coming years.
And interestingly, Andreas, sorry to interrupt again, they're not all in oncology, are they?
Exactly, and I think that's, if you like, one of the pleasing things, because although there's still a focus and there's still plenty of companies out there who are very much focused on those, what you might call ultra rare or very much defined genetic based indications, where it's a clear subgroup population who don't have a good standard of care at the moment, and there's a real unmet need that needs to be addressed. I think with a number of the oncology drugs, the science has moved so fast since the Act was put in place a number of years ago now, really, decades actually, which has allowed companies to move into that space and segment and better understand those oncology indications in a way that perhaps wasn't possible before. And that will be something that I suspect will continue, although I do wonder whether the more recent legislative developments might have an influence on that. So I'm thinking about the IRA, and I'm sure Jeremy will chip in on that later on in the discussion.
Absolutely. I mean, I think to some extent, even the bigger diseases, the more widespread conditions, they're being sliced into smaller segments just because that's how the science works. That's how we need to, as we uncover the mechanisms behind these conditions and segment patients, that's just the way it goes. But what's encouraging, I think, is to see these technologies graduate from very rare, often inherited genetic diseases into more widespread conditions. So yeah, that's encouraging. But I was just, oncology has dominated, as you say, Andreas, the orphan segment for reasons you've just explained. But it is, we're seeing, as you say, neuromuscular disease, a lot of blood disease products as well, and some other areas creeping in as well.
Yeah, and that was kind of the theme of I think the report that we put together last year, was that idea around a sandbox for different modalities and different technologies. There's a number of different directions this could go in, with CAR T or gene therapy drugs. So a really exciting time, actually, in terms of just moving on from being able to identify what's driving progression of a disease or causing the indication to develop in the way it is, and actually being able to not treat the symptoms but actually intervene at source and in effect correct the underlying genetic problem. And that's where we're seeing these a number of treatments with a very high price tag but a lifelong solution, if you like, which is again really exciting from a development point of view, because you're moving away from that chronic setting where you're treating symptoms and managing through to curative, really, which is obviously, the ideal place you'd like to end up.
Yeah, that is extremely exciting. And if you can take, as you suggest, if you can take those new modalities, looking at all the gene editing tools now, how they're progressing, if you can take these modalities into conditions that affect more people, imagine what the impact could be. So super exciting. I think that's a really good overview of the numbers, the trends, and you raised some really interesting questions. Andreas, is there any other data? I think we had a question from the audience. We did address it to an extent. Any changes are we seeing? Someone asks, any changes in therapy area rankings across orphan drugs? Now, I know definitely oncology is still on the top, but anything else happening behind the scenes that is of interest?
I think there's a number of things going on. So like you said, I guess maybe starting with the non-orphan space, there's a number of drugs being approved in areas that perhaps weren't the focus. In the orphan space, I think it is largely where things were. There's a definitely oncology, number of sort of blood related diseases as well, indications that they're always significant part of this market. But then with the rare diseases sort of piece, the nature is that there is a large number of them, and they are very, very but they do affect a small number of people. So sometimes rolling those up into a therapy area, you lose some of the detail, if you like, behind those. So I'd encourage anyone who's looked at the report to maybe go onto the platform and have a little dig around and explore what's going on beneath the sort of the big therapy area banners, and see where they can find those exciting assets that might be suitable to partner with or license.
Yeah, good plug. Definitely worth. Yeah, do definitely go and get the report and look at it in detail, because as ever, we can only touch on some of the bigger picture themes and the headline numbers. So we do encourage you to do that and to come back with any questions. Okay, so with that, I think we will now turn over to Jeremy. Bring Jeremy in here. Great. So, Jeremy, let me bring you in here. A quick reminder for our audience. The Inflation Reduction Act was signed last August. It introduces future drug price negotiations between Medicare and manufacturers of drugs that it spends the most on. Initially, that will be just 10 Part D outpatient drugs from 2026. But after that, it will ramp up very quickly to 60 drugs, Part D and Part B. So that's outpatient and inpatient drugs by 2029. Orphans with more than one indication, or should I say more than one designation, will also be included in the mix. And back to our report, that means 6 of the top 10 best-selling orphans for 2028, if you go back to that data Andreas showed, will fall into that category of having multiple designations. That includes AbbVie's Imbruvica, for instance, J&J's Darzalex. So those also would be at risk of price cuts. In fact, I saw some data the other day from the JMCP confirming which drugs are most likely to be included in those first cohorts, and indeed those 2 I mentioned are there. We're already seeing some consequences of the decision of the Inflation Reduction Act's orphan inclusion, if you like. Alnylam stopped work, or paused work, should I say, on a second rare indication for its orphan drug Amvuttra. That's a treatment that's already sold for a disease called transthyretin-mediated amyloidosis. We'll shorten that to ATTR. But that's on course to sell almost $3 billion by 2028. So the company has hit the pause button as far as developing it in another far smaller condition, Stargardt's disease, because those sales may be threatened, if so, under the impact of the IRA. So, Jeremy, with that long preamble, 2 questions. Do you expect the Inflation Reduction Act to significantly impact the bulk of orphan drug R&D, or are we just getting a bit of noise, a bit of bluster here? And then second, could this new legislation influence, catalyse further calls to update the original Orphan Drug Act, 40 years old, I think, now, and just fill us in on, where that's at? And I think there were already calls to change that before the Inflation Reduction came along anyway.
Melanie, it's a very serious question. Firstly, let's all acknowledge and recognize that this huge piece of legislation, which sweeps across the entire industry, of which there's only one line in it which really deals with orphan. However, that line is very, very impactful. You need to consider the following facts. Number one, the ramifications of this are still being worked out, the full ramifications. Nevertheless, on the acute side, you've just described a single instance where somebody has publicly stated, Alnylam, that they're going to stop development of an ancillary indication for one medication. Now, this is effectively the traditional provenance of life cycle management. So we can already see that others who probably don't talk about this are taking steps similarly to Alnylam. I would anticipate that that is definitely the case. Can't speak to it specifically, but I think that this is likely. A much more important consequence of this legislation, actually, is something which affects broad chronic disorders. And why do I say that? What's the relevance to that in an orphan disease? Well, in many instances, science has offered us a tremendous set of tools to examine the genetics of people, and as a consequence of that genetics, allowing us to target small orphan subsets of populations to allow us then to say, does my drug work on that subset? Now that's what's called a sentinel strategy. The sentinel strategy allows you at relatively low cost to develop a drug, an orphan drug effectively, which may have the ability, if it is on the right pathway, if it is something that has the same biology or similar biology or leads you to a clue of the biology for a much larger indication. Let me give you an example. Imagine we could have a genetic cause of Alzheimer's targeted, small subset. Works and does work well. You have a drug. Now, the real challenge will be, will a company then, under the current IRA, will they actually want to go on and develop a much larger indication, knowing that they would then be subject to the provisions of the IRA? Now, I'm not sure they would. So I think we're going to see a whole rethinking of that sentinel and very, very useful strategy for drug development. So that's one side. We can pause for a moment before I try and answer your second question, which relates to the Orphan Drug Act itself.
Thank you. I mean, that's a great point. It will boil. So it's going to change the order in which developers, progress their products away from the kind of logical start small and narrow, test out the strategy, as you say, genetically defined, and then broaden out, as we're already seeing with modalities like Alnylam's, right, into hypertension, into everything else, and sort of force that to be turned on its head, which is sort of scientifically nonsense.
And that's exactly right. And that's an inadvertent outcome of the IRA. It was not meant to do that. And I suspect that we'll have to have some rulemaking that permits it to be part of the current system without having penalized those who are using that innovative approach. So two areas that I think will be harmed on the development: one, life cycle management, and two, the use of the sentinel strategy to try and define a disorder, attack it, find a medicine, and then move on to see, does it actually have an impact on a broad-based population? And I think that's tremendously significant over the longer term. But I do believe this was inadvertent and a failure to understand how drug development actually is carried out.
Yes, I think there was a bit of rush through the language, etc. there. But what's interesting then is I'm just thinking how that could be worked around, I guess, with molecules that are similar but related but not the same ones, and workarounds saying, well, okay, we tested this in this molecule and then we tweaked it for the bigger indication. But yeah, we can get to that. So that was an inadvertent outcome, Jeremy. But in any case, I mean, what was it trying to do? It was trying to curb, I think, some of the blockbuster orphans, which have, gotten out of hand, if you like, particularly oncology, where they have just put one sub-indication upon another, and they haven't remained small, certainly in value terms.
Melanie, I would agree with you. I think that was the concern, and I think the Orphan Drug Act was not designed to deal with these large blockbusters. Now, we should understand that currently the costs of some of these medicines also have spiraled. For example, the average cost of an orphan drug in this country, average across all, is about $31,000 per year. But when you then sort of look at the ones that are topping 100,000, 150,000, that's a very significant number. Now, you have to put that against the average wage of somebody in this country, which is $71,000 per year. So the coupling where you have to really think this through now is, how do you couple reimbursement processes to deal with that vast number of very high-priced drugs? And the evolution of the reimbursement side has not kept up with the pricing strategies of the companies. So it's an important consideration. It's not just about the plethora of blockbusters. It's how do you get patients get access to those medicines given their insurance. And the insurance modalities have not actually kept up. There aren't, for example, there are many suggestions, one being mortgage-based payments, but we can go into that in greater depth. My point is very simple here. The original design of the Orphan Drug Act was not based on these huge blockbusters. You now have subsets of cancer drugs which are being treated as such. And at the same time, the pricing has gone up on many of them to the levels that I described. And yet, access to those drugs broadly is hampered by the fact that our access system, in the United States at least, has not kept up with the innovation either of these new molecules or of the genetics underlying how you subset populations, or indeed with the actual need of patients. So there's a real hole in the reimbursement side.
And absolutely, which I think we could do an entirely separate podcast on. But what I want to also discuss, Jeremy, is the incentive side of the Orphan Drug Act, because that I suppose these big orphans benefit from the R&D tax credits and from the exclusivity periods that the Orphan Drug Act offers, and which has been hugely successful in allowing the creation of the hundreds of drugs, I think 500 or more, that the FDA has approved since the Act came in. What you and I talked offline, what changes might occur at that end to try and address the issue, I suppose, that the IRA was trying to get at, but is a little bit too blunt at all? What could we do to tweak the sort of incentive end of it? I appreciate reimbursement needs to be addressed as well, but let's just talk about Orphan Drug Act 1983, was it? And what you've used the term Orphan Drug Act 2.0, and I've heard others do so. What does that look like? What could that look like?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is what we've seen in legislation is that a rush to legislation leads to unintended consequences. And so anything that touches the Orphan Drug Act, anything, needs to be fully, completely baked. Because if we don't, a system that was put up 40 years ago and has worked demonstrably well may actually cause inadvertent and very damaging changes. But if we take a look at what might be possible and what might be coming down the pike, because there's a lot of discussion and thinking around this right now, the Orphan Drug Act 2.0 will have to tackle some key elements. Number one, you have a disproportionate number of oncology drugs which fall into this bucket. The question will be posed, how do you deal with those? Do they get dealt with as a separate class? Or indeed, do you restrict the reimbursement specifically to single gene disorders and the types of medicines that tackle them? Is there a different type of incentive given to those who are developing a single drug for a single disorder than those who are developing the same drug for multiple different disorders? And I think those need to be thought through very carefully, because we've already seen some erosion of the original provisions. The tax incentives to R&D, which were a critical component to orphan disorders and their development of drugs, actually not only were critical, they actually fostered a tremendous upsurge in development. So you went from a handful of medicines when this was first mooted, the whole idea of the program, now to the hundreds that we have. And Melanie, I think we should understand that there are many different cancers and there are many different applications of a single molecule, PD-1 or something like that, to those disorders. Many. They're looking general medicines that attack multiple subgroups of patients. Conversely, we have, and actually we don't really know how many of those there are. We do have a handle, however, on the rare disease, the classical orphan disorder. There are about 7,000 of those single gene disorders that we know in humans. We know that they affect about 30 million American individuals. We know further that those single gene disorders will only ever have a single treatment, because that's, for example, SMA Others that we, Ovid, are treating, the rare epilepsies, have a single disorder that you treat, Dravet, for example. There are many others that fall into that category, which are a single gene, single treatment. That type of concept, two different groups of rare disorders, were never really mooted when the Orphan Drug Act was created. So now I think a lot of discussion needs to go into how do you separate them? How do you treat them as different disorders? And again, I believe that the way that this will eventually fall out will be different incentives in different areas. But again, I sincerely hope that it will be done in consultation with industry, with experts, because if we don't, we're going to have the same types of unintended consequences.
Yeah. And that's interesting, that differentiation between the single gene rare disorders and other sort of oncology subtypes. That's not the same as what I'm seeing more of rare versus ultra rare, is it? That's purely a prevalence. That's a number. That's a threshold. That's not good enough either, do you think, as a mechanism to?
No, prevalence really isn't. I think you have to understand that the life cycle management of a molecule can create multi-billion-dollar franchises when used within the context of a orphan disorder, an orphan designation, but the same molecule going across multiple different diseases. And cancer is not one disease. Cancer is many different diseases, subsets of populations of different types of cancer. And we need to really understand that. But they can easily be categorized as an orphan disorder because there are a few of them. However, if you now go to an Angelman's, for example, 1 in 17,000 individuals in the United States, or cystic fibrosis. These are single disorders, single genes, which you need to tackle as a single gene, and you need to tackle it in a way differently from the cancer, because there's no way that I can use a therapeutic for Angelman, which we were developing, for that of, for example, let's say Rett syndrome. It's not going to work, not another gene therapy.
So carving out potentially, and I understand your point about, we need to be thoughtful about this, but potentially single gene rare conditions that you outlined, but also then potentially just oncology as another bucket. So with a tailored incentive system, whether that's tiered R&D tax credits or whatever, for those at least two buckets as a potential way of approaching this.
Yes, and I think we need to work this out carefully, because as we start to segregate and understand, for example, Alzheimer's, it's not clear to anybody yet that that is a single disease. It might be multiple.
Yeah.
But right now, we're treating it as a single disorder, largely, not exactly right, but largely. And at the same time as that, you may find that we have subsets of patients who have very specific types of Alzheimer's. So if we can establish an understanding of what an orphan disease is relative to or a rare disorder or relative to cancer and single genes, I think we'll build a model that will help us as we start to unravel the complexities of other brain disorders, cardiovascular disorders, etc. And quite honestly, I think it's a very necessary exercise to explore this. Leaving it alone is not an option.
Yeah, I mean, it just feels like, just from our entire discussion today, from Andreas's data about, the fact that these are not a niche category as a whole anymore, over 50% of drug FDA approvals, to your point, Jeremy, that, it's the Sentinel strategy and the importance of orphan and rare disease drug R&D as a foundation for treatments that can help many, many more people as well. This feels like a very big endeavor and something that isn't going to change in the next year or two as far as specific orphan incentives are concerned. Is that fair? I mean, do you think this is just the beginning of quite a multi-year rethink potentially across the board?
I do believe that we have experience with other areas that tend to actually validate exactly what you said. In other words, a many-year process that will take time to understand and really fully validate and really acid test. Now, the example of that is as we even started to deal with the simplistic concepts of how to measure a biologic.
Yeah.
Look how many years it's taken for the biologics world to understand that so-called generic biologics, they're not really biosimilars, are actually a valuable tool and should be part of the armamentarium of physicians and patients. So I hold little hope that this will be solved quickly, but I do think it's going to be necessary. Now, one of those things that will force a faster approach is if indeed pricing and reimbursement are not adjusted to deal with the enormous cost to the system that is being loaded on by some of these new therapeutics. Now, most, if not all, are actually very, very valuable tools, and they can easily justify in all sorts of ways their cost. But the more you get, the more the requirement will be for our system in the United States and elsewhere to understand how you're going to give access to patients. And that will set a precedent not a precedent. It will provide for a pressure to solve for the Orphan Drug Act and to make an understanding of what are these rare disorders, what kinds of incentives should we be giving different companies, and what are the consequences to patients. And Andreas, I mean, your data was fascinating because as I read through it and understood what you were showing, I reflect on the fact that when I started in this industry, and albeit it is a long time ago, but not that long ago, it's very clear that pharmaceutical companies had zero interest in what were described as rare disorders as little as 10, 15 years ago. Now,
you're absolutely right, Jeremy. I mean, this has kind of been both the success and almost the too much success, if you like, of the original act. In some respects, it's generated that interest. It's stimulated the commercial model that's driven, the development of drugs in this space, which is fantastic in terms of outcomes for patients. But it's almost become so successful as the science has progressed over that period of time, where you have seen these oncology indications move in. You've seen the ability to really get down into understanding, like you were saying, those diseases at the genetic level, the different subpopulations within them. And it does increasingly feel that we're getting to the point where the science has moved significantly. The act is probably from a different scientific era, you could argue. And I think it needs another look. Add in the Inflation Reduction Act and these sort of unintended consequences with some of the language there. And you've got a very interesting mixture of factors before you even consider, as you were mentioning, the access and reimbursement at the patient level, which again is not designed to really handle these drugs effectively and provide the access that everyone wants to see at the end of the day. So that cocktail of great success, a good piece of legislation, some very strong outcomes, and then almost a victim of its own success is really coming back now, and it's stimulating a lot of this debate, I guess, around what's going to happen.
Andreas, I also think that there is a little bit of killing the goose that laid the golden egg going on here. Effectively, biotech took hold of the Orphan Drug Act and did exactly what it was intended to do, find new medicines for rare disorders. Now, very quickly, when the pharmaceutical industry, the broad, large companies understood the value of this, what they did was then to immediately move it into their hands, and overwhelmingly, they don't develop these drugs. Overwhelmingly, they are discovered elsewhere and then brought in to the pharmaceutical industry. And they are this pricing issue that you're seeing, this exploitation into the multi-billion-dollar franchises, is a direct result of the large companies' requirement for substantial revenues, which we all can understand. However, by forcing the payers and the government policymakers to really look at this carefully, there's an unintended consequence of our behavior as an industry. And that is suddenly to make sure to put pressure on the innovators who develop these to not develop them, because you're basically, unless you're very careful, the regulators will not distinguish, unless they're very careful, between the innovators who are really trying to find something special and new, and what you might say are the larger companies which are trying to get it out as broadly as possible at the highest price possible. And many times that price is very justified. The problem is when you start to sub-segment, put it into different disorders, the same molecule, and then it becomes untenable.
And there's a perception thing going. There's a risk here as well that we're talking about these difficulties and challenges and multi-billion-dollar drugs. There are also many, many rare diseases that are still not underserved. I just saw FDA, around Rare Diseases Day, not enough patients can be found. There are challenges that still need to be addressed that, if you like, the Orphan Drug Act hasn't yet reached. Its tentacles haven't got to all the corners, if you like, of this complex space. So we don't want to take away the need that still remains in the rare disease space. But equally, as you say, there's clearly a need to address the reimbursement side as well. To your point, Jeremy, I've got a question coming out. I don't know how, I think we're running up to time, but someone asks about the ISA white paper. The Institute of Clinical and Economic Review last April issued a white paper of their own. Now they're a non-profit that are all over sort of value-based pricing and determining how drugs should be priced in order to be deemed cost-effective in their view. They're increasingly influential in the US, I believe. And their paper's called Next Generation Rare Diseases Drug Policy, Ensuring Both Innovation and Affordability. And the question is, yes, to what extent do you agree? Are you familiar with the paper, Jeremy?
I've not yet read it, but I know it's on my table to be read.
Yes. So basically, they're proposing a set of policies that could address exactly the point you brought up. And I think the question is basically saying, does that align with what you're talking about? I mean, my answer would be yes, but I'm not the expert here. But it's basically things like tackling prices with value-based pricing and all that sort of thing, and encouraging ultra-rare drug development by establishing a definition of ultra-rare disorders and tailoring incentives for those treatment programs. And I think, Jeremy, you talked about tiered incentives. Does that make sense?
It on the face of it, it certainly intersects exactly with what I'm talking about. I mean, this is a very personal thing for us here at Ovid. You should know, we focus on rare disorders which are very rare, and we're trying to we try and conquer seizures. That's what we're interested in, and also try, hopefully, over time, to cure diseases. So cure epilepsy. So here's an exact example. We're focused on rare disorders. We have, for example, a channel called KCC2, where that there's a genetic disorder in humans which gives epilepsy. But we also know if we can tweak that channel, we might be able to affect a much broader array of disorders. So we're going to have to make a choice under the current designation. If we have a therapeutic in a rare disorder, which is designed specifically to conquer that epilepsy, that seizure, then how am I going to get this out to the broader population later on? Because if it works, and we believe it has a chance of working, how will I do it? So we deal with this on a daily basis. But Melanie, going back to what you said, I think it's critical for us to not jump into the deep end without knowing what's swimming in that pond. Because the unintended consequences could be absolutely devastating.
I think that's a really good piece of final wisdom, if you like. We're reaching time. This has been fascinating. There are 2 or 3 other questions, but I think we've answered them. There's one about pricing, the issue, which I think you tackled very well, Jeremy, and in fact came to early on in your remarks, which reflects the urgency of that issue. We talked about the patients, we talked about ISA. So unless there's anything either of you want to finish with, I think that note about the pond and the fish is a good piece of wisdom to finish on. Don't jump in before you know what's in there. So do you have any final comments, both of you, that you'd like to
go first, because I've talked far too much.
I've been actually just sat here listening, and it's kind of making me think of all the good things we've been talking about, all the things we're seeing in the industry, and I think more now than ever that my takeaway would be there's got to be some sort of change, otherwise we're going to end up with exactly that unintended consequences. So that's kind of my takeaway.
Andrea, well, for my part, Melanie, thank you for the opportunity to participate. It's really terrific. Andreas, your report is stunning. Thank you. I thought it was really interesting and definitely worthwhile absorbing the facts for all of us. And lastly, I would just reiterate that point. Let's think this through carefully, because the Orphan Drug Act was put in place. We now have layered on top of that the uncertainty of the IRA. We've got to be careful. And we need to be cautious about how we navigate our way through this particular set of issues.
Great. Well, thank you so much, both of you. Jeremy, great to have you on as well. Andreas, thank you for the data, which is fantastic. I think there will be more discussions to come, and I look forward to those very much. Watch this space. So thank you all, and I'll hand back over to Rebecca for the closing comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that's all we've got time for today. Thank you for all of you who have joined us and submitted all your questions. We'll be in touch to answer any that we didn't manage to cover in the discussion. Of course, a huge thank you to our panel of speakers today for all your insights and for a fascinating discussion. If you'd like to speak to us further, please drop a note into the Q&A and we'll reach out to you. And to say again, we will be sending the full recording of the webinar along with a link to download the slides and the report. So do keep an eye out for that. And thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Evaluate webinar. Thank you.